There's been one game series that's taken up a lot of my free time in the second half of this year: the Legend of Heroes Trails series. After beating and loving Cold Steel 1 and 2, I was hungry for more, and I saw that the original Trails series, Trails in the Sky, were available on Steam. I thought since I love those two games so much, I might as well check out where this series began. I've now completed both FC and SC, that stands for First Chapter and Second Chapter, and have played quite a bit of the third. And I feel I have enough in-depth thoughts on these games to make a full My Thoughts On series, though only for FC and SC at this point. I might do a video on the third after I beat it, we'll see. So if you want to hear my rambly thoughts on a few games that I played this year, tune in. I'll just give a brief overview to start. The Trails in the Sky games are JRPGs that are set in what is kind of a traditional fantasy world, but it's also undergoing an industrial revolution, meaning you've got a lot of steampunk-ish elements too. You still have what is essentially magic, but it comes from technological devices called orbments. These games are more for people who like RPGs for the story, although their battle system is very fun. Most of the games are quite linear. You go through a series of chapters and are usually restricted to only one part of the world in each one. If you're looking for exploration, this is not the RPG for you. What you will find, though, is tons and tons of world building. The Trails series is insane about this. Most random NPCs you see in cities will have a unique name, and they'll all be going about their business while the main story unfolds around them. You might see someone going out to buy groceries at one point, only to later see them in their house cooking dinner, for example. A lot of detail has gone into every city about its place in the world, society, trade, and it expands up to a more global scale, with the world having its international relations and politics pretty heavily fleshed out. Every sub-series tells its own relatively self-contained story, but they're all set in the same universe, the continent of Zemuria. And often, tiny insignificant details in one game will come back in a big way later on. Heck, there are even in-universe novels you can read that also contain major foreshadowing if you look into them hard enough. There are also quite a lot of side quests in these games, and they usually operate on some kind of points system. There's a certain number of points that are obtainable in every chapter, and you can get a perfect score by completing every side quest, and in some cases doing the side quests right, because some of them have very slight branches to them. For the battle system, I describe it as the positioning and movement of a tactical RPG, combined with Final Fantasy X's turn order system. The Sky games in particular are much more, I'd say, Fire Emblem-ish in their battle system, because unlike Cold Steel, there is a clearly defined grid that you can move in, and you have AoE attacks and other things like that. Characters and enemies' turns are visible in kind of a queue, with higher speed characters getting their turns more often. Characters have two types of special abilities: arts and crafts. Crafts are pretty much your average skills from RPGs, but they're usable through CP or craft points, which you gain by attacking or dealing damage. There are also super moves that your characters will eventually learn called S-crafts. These are usable when you have 100 CP out of a maximum of 200, but the closer you are to 200 CP, the stronger the S-craft will be. But using an S-craft will consume the entire CP meter, so knowing when to use them is key. Also, S-crafts can be used outside of the normal turn order through a mechanic called S-braking. This is really vital in this series, since sometimes turns will have special bonuses assigned to them, and S-braking is a great way to steal an auto-critical turn away from the enemy. Arts, on the other hand, are more like traditional magic. However, in the turn order, arts have casting time. When you first select an art, that uses up that turn, and a few turns later, you'll execute the art itself. Usually the casting time is relative to how powerful the art is. And as a nice anti-frustration feature, healing spells have very fast casting times. There are certain attacks, known as impede attacks, that can knock you out of casting, however. You'll need to make use of those yourself, because there are some enemies eventually that'll be using pretty powerful arts that you want to cancel. Story-wise, Trails in the Sky takes place in the small, independent nation of Liberl. If you played Cold Steel, you'll know that Erebonia has been trying to take over Liberl for ages, and Trails in the Sky picks up 10 years after the previous failed attempt. Its main characters are Estelle Bright, daughter of the most ridiculously in-story broken character of all time, Cassius Bright, and her adoptive brother slash love interest Joshua, because a lot of Japanese games seem to love that these days. Just to weigh in my thoughts, it actually doesn't feel as creepy as some quasi-incest romances to me, because he only got adopted into the family recently, so at the very least the Westermark effect wouldn't have kicked in, and the game never really plays it to the incest angle. Anyway, I'm not going to say much more about the story, because these games tend to have some pretty massive plot twists in them. If I ever do mention anything that possibly pertains to spoilers, I will warn you first. So with the basics out of the way, what were some of my impressions on the first game? Well, having played Cold Steel, the overall flow of the game was pretty familiar to me, with a couple of exceptions. For one, hard mode, which I'd like to start with now because I'm pretty experienced with RPGs, was genuinely difficult early in the game, unlike in Cold Steel where really only the bosses were ever hard on hard mode. I actually had to end up grinding quite a bit against the early enemies, but after that initial grind, the game isn't really all that difficult for the most part. Aside from one boss towards the end who's hard for all the wrong reasons, but I'll go into that later. The biggest shock to me gameplay-wise coming in from Cold Steel, though, was the way that orbments work in this game. For those who aren't aware, orbments are basically your magic system. So, like Cold Steel, every character has an orbment, and they have 8 slots for quartz in there. In Cold Steel, if you wanted, say, the Firebolt spell, you'd install a Firebolt quartz, as simple as that. Trails in the Sky, though, does not have any quartz that specifically give spells. Only buff quartz exist. Things like Attack 1, Speed 1, Evade 1, and secondary effects like the one that lets you see enemies on the minimap, or the one that lets you see treasure chests on the minimap. So how do you actually get magic? Well, every spell in the game has a set of elemental requirements for that spell. You can look these up in the in-game Bracer handbook. So for example, Firebolt requires 1 fire, whereas the AoE version Firebolt EX requires 3 fire, 1 wind, and 1 space. So I like to think of the quartz I install in orbments as energy cards from the Pokemon trading card game. You know how you could have an attack that requires like 1 fire and 2 colorless? It's kind of like that. The assortment of quartz and their elements you have equipped determines what spells you have access to. This system can get a little confusing in my opinion, and it means that if you want to change your quartz loadout, you could end up with a radically different spell loadout that you don't want. And if you want certain combinations of spells, you need to do a lot of fiddling around with specific quartz combinations. I don't know, it makes me feel weak for preferring how it is in Cold Steel, because I know that some people who came from Trails in the Sky might consider Cold Steel's system to be dumbed down, but I find being able to directly choose your spell loadout much more convenient. The other problem with this system is that often the buffs provided by the quartz don't synergize very well with the spells they provide. For example, if you want fire magic on your spellcasters, the best way to get it is to install attack quartz, which raise strength, which you don't really need on spellcasters. The quartz that increase magic are usually water elemental, but the majority of water spells are all healing. Wind in particular suffers from a major dilemma. As far as spells go, it has some of the best AoE attacks in the game, so you really want wind magic on your spellcasters. But one of the most common wind elemental quartz is the shield line, which raises magic defense but lowers magic. Actually, that's something else I could talk about. Unlike Cold Steel, buffing quartz have drawbacks in Sky. For example, quartz that raise strength slightly lower defense and vice versa. Quartz that raise accuracy lower evasion. Quartz that raise speed will eventually lower movement. I actually like this system, and I kinda prefer it to how Cold Steel works. It means that there's always a bit of a trade-off, and you can't just fully min-max characters like you can in Cold Steel. Also, another feature that I much prefer to Cold Steel, you can only have 1 of any type of quartz installed at one time. What I mean is, if you have attack 3 on a character, you can't have attack 1 or 2 on the same character. You're also limited to only 1 status ailment quartz per character. This means that setups like attack 123, speed 123, Laura smash everything from Cold Steel are no longer possible. And you can't stack multiple status quartz on someone with giant AoE attacks. That was always fun in Cold Steel, but admittedly a little bit broken sometimes. Other than those things though, gameplay is pretty similar to Cold Steel, so you should have no trouble getting into it if you played those games. I guess one other gameplay feature that I could talk about, there are far less hidden side quests in the Sky games than there are in Cold Steel. So you don't need to worry about having to talk to everyone at every possible time you can, just so that you don't miss side quests. Usually the missable side quests are extremely obvious, and most of the hidden side quests boil down to, there's an area that you have access to from this point in the game that you're never directly required to go for the story, but if you go there, you instantly trigger a hidden side quest. Getting 100% side quest completion, especially in the first game, is much easier than Cold Steel, though I will warn you, unlike in Cold Steel, where just hitting the highest possible rank by the end of the game was enough to get all the achievements, the Sky games have achievements for getting an outright perfect BP score. So if you're an obsessive side quest completionist like I am, you have to complete every side quest and perfectly. I guess while we're on the subject of BP, I can talk about that one fight in the first game that I promised that I'd get back to. There is a boss fight towards the very end of the game. In fact, it's the last fight before you enter the final dungeon. And story-wise, it's a fight you're supposed to lose. However, it is possible to win the fight. It doesn't change anything in the plot, but it does give you extra BP towards your grade for that chapter, and it does give you an achievement, meaning that if you're a 100% completionist, you have to win. Now to go off on a bit of a tangent here, Tales of Exilia had something kinda similar. The first fight with Gaius in that game is designed so that the story still continues as normal regardless of whether you win or lose, and you are expected to lose. But if you're a decent player, you can win that fight, and the fight is designed to be tough but fair. This fight, though, it's really not handled all that well. So, firstly, you only have 3 party members for this fight, rather than a full party of 4. Secondly, one of your 3 party members only has a healing S-craft, not a damaging one, so that already sets you back quite a bit. Here's the problem, though. This boss, if you do everything right, has almost zero chance of actually outright killing you. Their attack power isn't that high, even their S-craft is not that dangerous, and one of your characters has a massive strength debuff craft that pretty much prevents him from hurting you at all. But they still made the fight hair-pullingly difficult to win. How? By giving him a really big HP heal spell, and a spell that blocks the next 2 attacks directed against him that he can spam as much as he wants, and with almost zero casting time. Whether you win or lose this fight comes down entirely to how much he feels like healing and guarding. In other words, it's pure luck. If he starts spamming Earthguard EX and healing, there is no way you are beating him before you run out of EP, and you'll just be forced to intentionally die. And Adios help you if he decides to double heal. Oh, by the way, he is stupidly fast, and you have no access to speed debuffs in the first game. So you need to be absurdly lucky to even be given a chance to cancel one of his spells. And usually, if you do, he just casts the spell again instantly. What makes this even more irritating is because this is a fight that the plot still continues if you lose, you don't get a retry option, so the only way to redo the fight is to reload a save and sit through the cutscene before the fight again. You can speed through text bubbles by holding down Control and Alt. That is a sanity savior if you're going for this. After maybe 2 hours of attempts, I finally managed to beat him, and only because the one time I did, he didn't heal or guard. Yeah, you pretty much need his AI to let you win, and in my opinion, that's not a well-designed fight. I know you're not supposed to win, but if you're gonna make a fight that's ridiculously hard but does give the player a reward for actually winning, make winning based on skill and not luck. Seriously. Anyway, that was the only fight in the first game that I felt was genuinely frustrating. The final boss is actually kind of difficult, but it feels more difficult for the right reasons. So, overall, Trails in the Sky FC is a pretty solid game. However, this is gonna sound weird, but I don't recommend buying it. Definitely go ahead and do so if you have extra time on your hands, but I personally don't think the first game is necessary. Yes, the first game ends on a cliffhanger that leads directly into the second game. However, everything you need to know about the first game's story is already recapped to you in the second game anyway. Not only that, but the second game is where the plot actually becomes remotely interesting. FC's plot I really didn't enjoy all that much because there really isn't much of one. For the vast majority of the game, the plot is just go from town A to town B and solve some kind of petty crime in town B. Sure, at the very, very end, and I do mean the last few minutes of the game, you find out that one big bad was secretly behind everything. But the incidents all still feel so isolated. And barely anything that happens is relevant until the very end of the second last chapter and the end of the last chapter. Plot-wise, skipping the first game will not affect much. The only thing remotely interesting in the first game's plot is the cliffhanger at the very end. And don't get me wrong, that moment is great, but honestly, I'd recommend simply looking up that scene on YouTube and then playing SC. None of the characters have much time to develop in FC either. Estelle and Joshua are the only two party members who are with you for the whole game. Estelle has an arc, but all it is realizing she's been a big dense tsundere and has been in love with Joshua all along, which is painfully obvious to everyone except her. As for Joshua, the only significant plot involving him happens in the last minutes of the game. Every other character is essentially just a guest. You have two party members for each chapter, apart from the prologue. They're with you for that chapter, and then they're gone for the rest of the game until they come back at the very end. It is not until the final dungeon that you have control over who's in your party. So you have every party member for such a short amount of time that none of them have a chance to develop beyond the broad stereotypes they're established as. I didn't find myself getting attached to many of the characters in FC, except for one, and only because this character also appears in later games, and having played the later games first, I'd already been spoiled on major revelations about them. Even the gameplay is fairly limited in FC. Really, all of FC feels like one big demo for SC. I've compared this to Cold Steel 1 vs 2 in the past. While Cold Steel 1 is definitely just a big prologue for the overall Erebonian story, it still felt like a complete game to me. Whereas Sky FC feels more like what I said, a demo. So if you don't have a lot of time on your hands, I'd recommend skipping the first game. You actually aren't missing out on much. The only thing you really are is, if you import a 100% file of FC into SC, you get a couple of extra accessories at the start of the game. They can help early on in SC, but they're not necessary. Anyway, on to SC. The main reason why I would recommend jumping into this one is because, both story and gameplay-wise, it is vastly superior to FC. The characters actually have proper development. The game is probably twice as long as FC. The antagonists are so much more interesting. Even the music gets better, and that's saying something because the first game's soundtrack was already fantastic. SC even opens up in a nice tutorial area that I feel personally is a better tutorial than the first game, so it actually works surprisingly well as a standalone game, despite the fact that there are chess messages that say, "Huh, I wonder if anyone played this game that didn't play the first game, I bet they're confused." In my opinion, no. To talk about why I think SC's story is so good would be definitely spoiling things. It's best experience for yourself, so I won't say too much about it. But I ended up liking most of the characters so much more after this game. However, if you are jumping straight into SC, I have a very big warning for you. If you don't want a very, very big challenge, do not play hard mode on your first playthrough. I did this and it was a mistake. The first game's hard mode was relatively difficult early on, but not that much elsewhere. SC's hard mode is honestly one of the most brutal JRPGs I have ever played, and that includes Fire Emblem and Shin Megami Tensei. In fact, in many ways, it was even worse. Enemies do devastating damage to you early on, and their stats are multiplied so much to the point where you don't do much damage back to them. You need to be very, very careful with your resources, or on the higher difficulties, you can actually render the prologue outright unwinnable. The end boss of the prologue is absolutely insane on hard mode. They're incredibly fast, so they double turn you a lot, and you generally can't survive more than 2 hits from them. They also knock you all the way across the battlefield just by hitting you. You only have 2 party members, one of whom has absolutely no range capability whatsoever, and if you try and stay out of their range, the boss will actually say, "You're never out of my range," and use a free spell attack on you that doesn't have any cast time. This battle is a vicious wake-up call, and things don't get much better for a while. After leaving the tutorial area, you'll come face to face with enemies that are pretty fast, deal devastating damage, and have basic attacks with a chance of instant death. These are just regular enemies in the first areas you have access to. And that's not even getting into the side quest hunt monsters. Apparently what happened is that SC was a difficulty spike over FC because they expected most people playing it would have played the first game. So, its normal mode is roughly equivalent to the first game's hard. Early battles are definitely winnable with the right strategy, but you will be failing a lot if you're unprepared for the difficulty. And it's kind of frustrating because SC is one of the only games I play that both has a great story and is really hard. Usually games are either one or the other. I really want to find out what happens next in the plot, but I'm spending hours dying to this one boss. It's frustrating. So for that reason, I'd recommend playing on normal if you're new to the game, even if you're a seasoned veteran of JRPGs. One thing I will say about SC that is plain unfair difficulty though is Npc Escort Missions. This is one of the few things in these games that I describe as outright terribly designed. So, for some side quests, and even worse, some parts of the main story, you have an NPC ally. Usually, they're completely useless because they're some random civilian, so they just run around doing nothing, and if their HP reaches 0, you get an automatic game over. In FC, this wasn't so bad, because usually the NPC's stats scaled well to the area you were in. In SC though, oh boy, they did not scale the NPC's stats to properly match the strength of the enemies, especially on hard mode. I'll just put it simply, on hard mode, and this isn't even nightmare mode by the way, every basic enemy one-shots NPC escortees guaranteed. So you're pretty much forced to use an Earth Guard on them. That is, if you get the time, because sometimes the enemy will get the first turn, run up, and kill the NPC before you even got a chance to do anything. This happens surprisingly often, and this should never happen in any RPG, being able to lose a fight before you even had control. Chapter 1 is particularly irritating with this. At one point, you get an NPC in your party for the main storyline of that chapter, and if you want to do a lot of the hunt side quests, you're forced to bring this NPC into the battles, where they will inevitably get one-shotted and lose you the fight, often when you're very close to winning. But even more infuriatingly, you eventually come across a mini-boss when you continue with the story. This NPC, who gets one-shotted by everything, is mandatory in this mini-boss fight. After the fight, which is already a very annoying fight, by the way, one of your party members tells the NPC, "This area is too dangerous for civilians, you should stay here." Really? Really? We could have used that before that NPC was forced into the really annoying mini-boss fights. Oh, that was frustrating. The second worst of the NPC escorts is a hidden side quest right after Chapter 2. You get into a battle with an NPC that is guaranteed to be an enemy advantage, and there are about 10 enemies on the field. So, you just have to pray that none of them choose to attack the NPC before you have control, because otherwise, bang, game over, before you even got to do anything. It's really, really, really painfully annoying. While NPC Escort Missions thankfully aren't anywhere near that bad from then on, it's just such a sore point for me, and I really don't think it was good game design. They really should have made NPC stats scale depending on the difficulty. Speaking of difficulty, it doesn't really let up for the first 4 chapters. All of them end with pretty brutal boss fights. However, as I played further, I noticed something strange. Starting with about the halfway point of the game, it started to get a lot easier. Now, it's hard to say why. I will say that some of the end chapter bosses are legitimately a lot easier in the later chapters, but I think it's also because you've finally got access to good quartz and thus good spells. A third reason, though, is about halfway through the game, a party member joins you. They start out 15 levels higher than you're expected to be at that point in the game. They have really good crafts and arts right off the bat. They're insanely good from there right up until the end of the game, and they're forced into your party for the next few straight chapters. I would say this character is so good that they make the game easier just by their mere presence. You will eventually catch up to them thanks to the way that experience scales, but even then, it's still recommended you use them until the very end of the game. They're just that good. So, the second half of the game is far easier than the first. Until you hit the very, very end. The last few bosses are actually pretty brutal. Weirdly though, the boss that gave me the most trouble was not the most infamous boss in the game. It was the one immediately beforehand. The most infamous boss in the game, whose name I won't mention thanks to spoilers, I, weirdly enough, beat it on the first try. Although this might have been because, one, I wasn't holding back in that fight, I was just using all the party members that I felt were the absolute best. Like, objectively, whereas in the earlier fights, I was focusing on bringing characters who, plot-wise, really should be there for those fights, so that did handicap me a lot. But I think also it boiled down to reverse hype backlash. I'd heard this fight hyped up so much as being the hardest fight in the game, that when I actually got there, it felt disappointing compared to all the hype. Whereas I didn't hear any difficulty hype on the fight beforehand, so its difficulty caught me completely off guard, and I took ages on that fight because I kept getting destroyed. But yeah, even I couldn't believe it when I managed to beat the most infamous fight in the game on my first try. Though, he never actually used his second S-Craft on me, which is weird. He never used Dead Emperor's Sword, so maybe that makes things harder? I'm not sure exactly what it does, but I probably don't want to find out. I mean, whatever it is, you can probably just earth wall it anyway. And that'll be a good segue into game balance. There's a couple of things in the game that I did find to be a little bit broken, so I'll discuss those now. Firstly, Earthguard and Earthwall. These are, Earth Elemental spells that give one character and an AoE, respectively, a guard that protects them from the next attack, physical or magical. I mentioned Earthguard being essential to protecting NPCs early on in hard mode, but it is pretty decent as well for protecting your main party members. Once you get Earthwall though, that's when the fun really begins. Earthwall existed in both FC and SC. Its EP cost was jacked up almost double in SC just because of how good it is, and I still feel it's incredibly undercosted for what it does. If you stay huddled together, you can very easily spam Earthwall constantly on one of your spellcasters and make your party permanently invincible. Early on in the game, its casting time is very long, but once you have access to the casting time boosting quartz and speed boosting quartz, it ends up being very quick to cast, so you can easily just get it up, enemy uses an S-Craft, gets rid of your guard, then you just get it back up again. Having an Earthwall spammer makes the final fights much easier. The other spells that are really good are, just like in Cold Steel, anything Time Quartz related. Time Quartz mostly focus on raising speed. Speed is by far the best stat in the game, because it affects how often you get your turn. And it also shortens the delay between your turns. This is another reason why that one character I talked about is amazing, because they specialize in speed. You really want speed boosting quartz on everyone in your party at all times. Not only is the speed increase great, but the spells that element of quartz gives are all great too. Mainly because they give access to more speed buffs. The regular Clock Up is not that useful, but its better version, Clock Up EX, which raises speed by 50%, is absolutely essential on the higher difficulties. You must always start every boss fight by casting Clock Up EX on everyone. Trust me, it makes things so much easier. Unlike in Cold Steel though, there are no AoE speed buffs. I actually think this is a good decision because speed is so broken, so having an AoE would make it even worse. Because seriously, for Clock Up EX to be this good and only be a single target spell is really saying something. But there's also its sister, Clock Down. This is only accessible in the second game. But it's an AoE spell that drops the enemy's speed by 50%. Very few bosses are immune to this, even the hardest ones in the game. So this is also essential to cast in any tough fight. Clock up EX and clock down, you want on pretty much every character by endgame. And the great thing is, in addition to those spells, you also get some really good offensive magic through Time Quartz too. In both FC and SC, there are no areas where the higher elements are active, which means that time spells are effectively non-elemental and very few things resist them. Also, there are some great AoE spells in there, and almost all of them have a chance of inflicting either faint or instant death. Death Scream in particular is a spell that you want to get as early as possible. It hits the entire field and has a chance of instant death. But I even found that just spamming Soul Blur worked wonders for some of the later fights. In terms of actual character skills, one party member, Chloe, has access to a couple of them. Firstly, they're all German names, so I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but like Kampfer? I more know this as Sieg Take 'em Down by the voice clip she says when using it. This craft is incredibly broken in the first game, because it reduces the target's strength and defense by 50% each. From the way this game calculates damage, even a tiny difference in either strength or defense makes for a huge difference in damage. Hit a boss with this, and not only will you be doing massive damage to them, but their attacks will usually be doing about 1 damage to you. It essentially renders them harmless. And only the final boss is immune to stat debuffs in the first game. Sadly, this spell got nerfed severely in SC. It now only drops strength by 15% and defense by 10%, or by 30% in its upgraded form. It's still nowhere near as good as it was in the first game. However, her S-Craft is also pretty useful. This is the healing S-Craft I mentioned earlier. It has a large AoE, and it's a full heal to any conscious character, both HP and status. And if you use it when you have 200 CP, it also buffs defense by 50%. It'll also revive any unconscious character, though not by much HP. This is a great panic button to have on standby as an S-break, but it is easy to cheap your way out of a lot of fights, because often, whenever a boss does massive damage to the party, it's enough to instantly give Chloe her S-Craft, so you can just use this and bang, instantly healed. Especially if you give Chloe the gladiator items, you can spam this pretty much all fight sometimes. It feels cheap, but it can help in tough situations. However, when you get Kevin in the second game, he has an even more broken S-Craft. Grail Sphere is essentially an Earth Guard on the entire party. I mean, technically it is just a limited AoE, but the AoE is so huge it'll usually hit your entire party anyway. But the best thing about this is that at 200 CP, it gives you a double Earth Guard, meaning your entire party is invincible to 2 hits. Again, having this as a standby panic button S-break is absolutely amazing. Earth Wall wore off and you think the boss is going to use an S-Craft soon? Grail Sphere! Boss is charging a massive AoE attack that does huge damage, and you're not going to be able to cancel it in time? Grail Sphere! Any battle situation whatsoever? Grail Sphere. It's just that good. And it's pretty much why you almost never see a final battle party in SC that doesn't include Kevin. In fact, if you're having trouble with any of the later bosses, bring Kevin. His presence immediately makes them easier. I suppose I should mention Joshua's S-Crafts, except for his first one, are all really good too, because all of them hit the entire field, which is actually pretty rare for damaging S-Crafts in this game. Now, there is one skill that I'd read about being broken, but I personally didn't find to be as good as the hype made it out to be. Agate's Wild Rage. In the second game, this sacrifices 75% of his max HP, so you need to be careful because he can easily kill himself if his HP is too low. But in exchange, he gets 150 CP, 3/4 of a full CP bar, and giving him his S-Craft immediately. While this sounds very good, and in the second game you can get Agate to join you quite early, I just never found this skill to be that good on hard mode, mainly because magic is usually better than physical attacks, especially in the early game on hard. And Agate is kind of slow, so his turns usually don't come up often enough. In theory, if you have Agate spam this and have somebody heal him after each time he uses it, you can keep an endless streak of S-breaks going. But I never really found an opportunity to do that on hard because the enemies were just too fast. So, late game, I ended up using Xin as my main physical attacker rather than Agate. Xin is kind of weird in that he starts out not that good, but he later learns some incredibly powerful skills. His really mediocre starting buff skill turns into a buff that increases strength and defense by 60%. And it's around this time that he also learns Thunder God Kick, which I kind of feel is actually bugged, since it doesn't work this way in the third game. In the second game, it's a physical craft with a medium-sized AoE, but it hits multiple times depending on the number of enemies caught within the AoE. So for example, if you hit one enemy, it only hits once, but if you manage to catch, say, 4 enemies, each enemy gets hit 4 times. Combine that with the 60% strength buff, and it sometimes out-damages S-crafts by a considerable margin, making Xin incredibly powerful later in the game. But I still wonder if this is actually a bug, because in the third game, Thunder God Kick always hits once, regardless of the number of enemies caught in the blast. Going back to the first game for a bit, I should mention the Confuse spell, Chaos Brand, is actually very, very strong in that game, because very few enemies, not even bosses, are immune to confusion. And the bosses that are usually have lackeys that are not. The hilarious thing is that this spell is even better on hard mode, because the enemy's ridiculously inflated stats mean they do huge damage to each other, vastly out-damaging your party. I guess I can talk about a few skills or characters that I found to be a little underpowered. I never found the wind elemental buffs that useful. They buff movement and evasion, and I don't know, it just didn't really feel like I needed that. I'd much rather buff speed, strength, or defense. There's also a spell that silences the entire field, but the majority of enemies that it would be worth using on are immune to that status anyway. Also, some of the highest tier spells, it was just so much of a hassle getting together all the quartz to actually use them, and they're often a bit disappointing, usually costing way too much EP and just having way too long casting time for their damage. In terms of characters, there is really only one character that I felt was very, very underpowered, and oh boy are they underpowered. So, there is a character who, in the second game, doesn't join you until partway through the final dungeon. Their level is terrible for the point you get them, and even if you grind them up to the level of the rest of the party, their stats are still really bad. There is nothing they can't do that other party members can't do better. They don't even have an S-craft when they first join. Just overall, why? It feels so pointless that this character even joins you, because they're so useless. To all you Fire Emblem fans who watch my channel, this would be like if you got S'd during the final chapter of a Fire Emblem game, midway through the final chapter, and she didn't even have good growths. That is this character in a nutshell. They are that bad. Other than that, there aren't any truly horrible characters in the party, but there are definitely some who stand very, very far above others, like Kevin, and really most of the dedicated spellcasters, Joshua, Xin, but only later in the game. I don't know if it's just me, but I always found Estelle was kinda mediocre for the majority of both games. She's kind of a jack of all trades. You can set her up as either a physical user or an arts user, and she is one of the first people to learn an AoE attack, but it is painfully weak in terms of damage. I don't know, maybe I was just using her wrong, but she did feel very weak for the main character of the game, who's forced into your party always. Around the second half of the game, I'd usually just stack her with buff spells and make her a buffer, because wasting her turn to buff people was less detrimental than the turns of other better characters. Though I did choose to make her legendary weapon at the end of the second game, and she actually became a powerhouse then. So I think those are all the thoughts I have on these two games, without going into plot spoilers, obviously. And I don't really want to talk about plot spoilers, because I do definitely plan on recording these games sometime in the future. I do want to do Cold Steel 1 and 2 first, but the way I'm thinking of doing this is, I'll do Cold Steel 1 and 2, and then I'll do the Sky games in between Cold Steel 2 and 3. as kind of an extended flashback. In particular, to any Cold Steel fans out there, I would highly recommend playing SC at least in the lead up to Cold Steel 3. Because while Cold Steel 1 and 2 had no connections to the Sky games, let's just say a plot point that's revealed in Sky SC comes back with major repercussions in Cold Steel 3. And I do mean very major repercussions. So now is the perfect time to play SC. Definitely check this game out if you're a fan of story-driven RPGs. You can play the first game if you want, but if you don't have much time on your hands, I still think skipping straight to SC is not a bad idea. As for the third, like I said, I might talk about that later. I've only played about half of it at this point. It is considerably easier than SC. It may even be the easiest game in the series outside of a couple of boss fights. But the majority of the third is aimed at fans of the first two games. It's really mostly a fan service game. I would not recommend playing it as your first introduction to the Sky series at all. SC pretty definitively ends the story started in SC. The third is its own separate plotline that's mainly focused on tying up a couple of loose ends for the region of Liberl as a whole. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing my thoughts on these games, and I guess I'll see you next time in my next thoughts video.